Okay, so you ever hear that phrase, don't poke the bear?
Hmm.
Well, in family law, the judge, that's the bear you really don't want to mess with.
Oh, absolutely. And especially in a divorce case.
Right.
Yep.
It's like all the ingredients for a perfect storm, emotions, money, kids, all while a relationship is already falling apart.
Yeah, and sometimes somebody decides to take things into their own hands, throws the rule book out the window, and that's when things get really interesting or messy, depending on how you look at it.
Totally. And that brings us to the wild case of, get this, Purcaru v. Purcaru.
Oh yeah, this one's a classic, like a textbook example of what not to do if you're in the middle of a divorce battle.
It's 2010, Ontario's Superior Court, and we're diving deep into the court documents to break down this legal train wreck.
Okay, so picture this.
I'm ready.
2003. Mr. and Mrs. Purcaru, 7 years of marriage, 2 kids, and they decide to call it quits.
Okay, pretty standard so far, right?
So far, so normal. But here's where it gets interesting.
Hit me with it.
These cases, family law cases, they get complicated fast, especially with emotions running high, big assets on the line.
Oh yeah, things can get really messy really quickly when it comes to dividing up property and money.
And one of the biggest red flags for the courts is when one person tries to hide assets, move money around, to avoid sharing it in the divorce.
Ooh, sneaky. So how'd that play out in this case?
Well, while the divorce is still ongoing, Mr. Purcaru decides to, get this, buy a house with another woman.
Wait, hold up. He's in the middle of a divorce, and he thinks it's a good idea to buy a house with someone else. That's, bold.
Bold is one word for it, yeah.
Yeah.
But for the court, it's a huge red flag. Looks an awful lot like he's trying to stash away assets. And we're not talking about a little cottage in the woods here. This is 2005. They bought a house in Toronto for $740,000.
Okay, so a decent chunk of change. What about this other woman, Mrs. Selverstova?
Right. She put in $300,000 of that.
Okay, so now there's a significant amount of money potentially tangled up in this divorce. You can see why Mrs. Purcaru might be a little bit concerned about this, to say the least.
Well, concerned is putting it mildly. And believe it or not, this house purchase, that was just the tip of the iceberg.
So we've got Mr. Purcaru buying a house with another woman while in the middle of a divorce. Not exactly subtle, is it?
Subtlety wasn't his strong suit, it seems. And remember we were talking about how courts try to stop spouses from hiding assets during a divorce?
Right, to try and keep things fair.
Exactly. Well, in this case, the court hit Mr. Purcaru with, get this, 4 separate court orders between 2006 and 2009.
4. What were those supposed to do?
Basically, they were supposed to freeze his finances, prevent him from selling stuff, moving large amounts of money around, like a legal timeout.
Okay, makes sense. So did he listen?
Well, this is where Mr. Purcaru's judgment seems to, disappear a little bit. Despite those orders, he goes ahead and takes out a $500,000 line of credit on that house.
Hold on, seriously. He took a loan out on a house he wasn't even supposed to own outright.
Yep, and it gets better. He then used that line of credit to pay back Miss Silverstova her initial $300,000.
Oh, I see. So it's like he was trying to make it seem like she wasn't involved anymore, cover his tracks. But wasn't that exactly what those court orders were trying to stop?
You got it. And if you thought that was bad, he also withdrew $97,000 from his retirement savings.
Oh, no.
Well, yes, and then loaned, and I'm using that word very loosely here, $325,000 to, wait for it, his brother in Romania.
Is he for real? Talk about waving a giant red flag in front of the court. And all this happens right before the divorce trial was about to start in 2009.
Timing, as they say, is everything. And remember, family law courts, they're not just there to divide up who gets the china and who gets the dog. It's about ensuring a just outcome, especially when there are children involved.
Okay, so how did Mrs. Purcaru and, more importantly, I guess, the court respond to all this?
Well, Mrs. Purcaru was not going to let him get away with this, understandably. She went back to court and asked the judge to do something pretty drastic. Strike Mr. Purcaru's pleadings.
Strike his pleadings. Okay. In plain English, what does that even mean?
Basically, it's like silencing him in court. Imagine you're at a debate, you break all the rules, the moderator, they can just cut you off. You don't get to talk anymore.
So she's saying he's been such a rule breaker that he doesn't even get to defend himself anymore.
Pretty much. And she went even further, filing motions to specifically address those asset transfers, the house payment, the money to Romania. She was saying he was intentionally trying to cut her out of what she was owed.
Wow. It's getting hard to see how Mr. Purcaru can talk his way out of this one. What was his defense?
So you'd think he'd be scrambling for a good explanation at this point, right?
Sure.
Nope. He tries to turn the tables, claiming that those very restraining orders on his assets were preventing him from, get this, paying for his legal defense.
He's kidding, right? He's blaming the court for his inability to follow the court's orders.
You see the problem there, except, here's the kicker. Remember how he previously claimed he could easily put down $635,000 to avoid these problems?
Oh, so which one was it? Could he access the money or not?
Exactly. It seems our friend Mr. Purcaru may have forgotten about his previous claims.
So he's saying he doesn't have the money now, but before he was practically bragging about having tons of it. Not a good look.
No, not at all. Justice Kelly, who was the judge on the case, he saw right through it. He basically called Mr. Purcaru out for being dishonest and disrespectful to the court.
Did Mr. Purcaru try anything else to save face?
He did try to argue that he wanted to challenge the financial side of the divorce settlement, said he had a strong case if the court would just hear him out.
Okay, so maybe a last-ditch effort to get back on track.
Maybe. But even then, the solutions he suggested always seemed to benefit. Guess who, Mr. Purcaru?
Like what? What was he suggesting?
Oh, for example, he said he'd only pay certain amounts if Mrs. Purcaru agreed to renegotiate parts of the settlement that had already been decided, like going back on previous rulings and starting over.
So he's basically trying to hold the whole thing hostage, using money as leverage.
The court definitely seemed to think so. And then there's the new evidence he kept mentioning. Turns out this new evidence was stuff that had been available the whole time. He just chose not to use it during the initial trial.
Why would he hold back something that could help his case? That doesn't make sense.
Your guess is as good as mine. It just makes it seem like he was trying to game the system, you know? Maybe hoping for a better outcome if he delayed things, or just trying to wear Mrs. Purcaru down with all the legal back and forth.
So what happened? What did the court decide?
Justice Kelly had heard enough. He wasn't buying any of it. He said it was clear that Mr. Purcaru was intentionally trying to undermine the court and delay justice for his own benefit.
Wow, so what was the verdict?
The court sided with Mrs. Purcaru and struck down Mr. Purcaru's pleadings, which means he lost the right to participate in the case. He was basically silenced.
Wow, that's a pretty dramatic ending, all that maneuvering, and it backfired completely.
It really goes to show that when you're dealing with the law, you can't just do whatever you want. Trying to outsmart the court can have serious consequences.
This case really shows how important it is to respect the legal process, even if you don't like the outcome.
Definitely. It's understandable to want to fight for yourself, especially in a divorce, which can be so emotional, but there are lines you can't cross.
Absolutely. Well, this deep dive into the wild world of Purcaru v. Purcaru definitely gave us a lot to think about. Sometimes the best lessons come from seeing what not to do.
I'll second that.
Thanks for joining us for this legal roller coaster. And to our listeners, knowledge is power. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.